nuclear energy on the European level, what it means. For instance, we've tackled the issue of nuclear waste on with a landmark report, which is basically the first of a kind, mapping out what the way countries deal with nuclear waste, the finance behind that, the search for storage. That's been one of the major milestones in my program. What we of course do every year is that we support the World Nuclear Industry Status Report, which is basically a flagship report giving you the whole overview of the current state of affairs in of European nuclear energy. Meaning, if you want to know anything going on about, for instance, what's the share of nuclear energy in the electricity mix of, let's say, Poland, for instance, or how does France actually have a certain opinion on nuclear energy at the European level, the facts behind all these assumptions are all covered in the yearly World Nuclear Industry Status Report. I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of different dossiers that we also have on our websites and other publications. I think first and foremost, one of the big projects this year came with the fact that in 1986, the Chernobyl incident was basically one of the most devastating effects that you could have and possibly have thinking about nuclear energy. And this year meant the 35 years of this event. And for that regard, we've published a dossier on our website. So please check it out. The link has now been put in the chat by my colleague, Joan. You'll find on this dossier a couple of introductory pieces about specifically why nuclear energy is such a risky technology. It breaks down the nitty and gritty of the economic aspects, why it's basically very expensive, and why that also keeps a lot of countries from investing in at the moment. It's also compiled a couple of videos from high-ranking experts and ministers of energy, long-standing nuclear energy activists. Please have a look at this dossier. I think it's a very good introduction to all the different strands on nuclear energy that can be covered and is covered in our work at the Brussels office of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. Another paper I wanted to draw your attention to is a bit more technical, but we have the luck to have one of the authors right here today, which is a sustainability at risk. It's called. It's a critical analysis on the so-called taxonomy. If you've ever heard this terrible buzzword at the moment, the EU taxonomy regulation is basically a very technical term for determining where financial flows for energy technologies will go for the next couple of years. And that's why this very technical subject is going to be very important and currently one of the hottest debates in Brussels and the European Union. So please also check out this paper. One of the co-authors, Dr. Christoph Pissner, is here among us, and I'll also hand over to him in a minute. Then maybe allow me also to share one of the other publications in the dossier, which is basically also very good as a kind of link to our discussion that we'll have today, meaning the energy mix and the kind of questions linked to climate neutrality and how to basically decarbonize a system if you want to phase out coal, oil and gas, and not rely on nuclear. That's basically, of course, the overall framework. And so the article is about 7 reasons why nuclear energy is not the answer to solve the climate change. And this kind of provocative title also inspired us for one of the subtitles for our event today, because I think it's of course easy to say that the Greens, based on their long-standing history with anti-nuclear energy, have a certain perspective on a topic, but what we want to actually dive into today is the facts behind that. We want to actually understand why certain perspective on nuclear energy have gained traction in the European debate at the moment, and on the other hand, why it's still a risky technology with a lot of problems involved, and we want to understand why that is. So without further ado, I'd now stop and basically quickly just introduce Dr. Christoph Pissner, I've already mentioned, who's a long-standing nuclear energy expert. I think he's a trained physicist and engineer, if I remember it correctly, and he's working for the Öko Institute in Germany. And our second panelist, an expert later, is Patricia Lorenz, who's working with Friends of the Earth Europe in Austria. And I'll hand over to Christoph now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. I understood that my job today would be to give the audience a general introduction into the major topics related to problems of nuclear energy. So I've prepared some slides. Now I'm just trying to share them with you now. So do you see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk shortly on the questions of safety, waste, and proliferation, the major topics related to nuclear energy. Of course, the issues are much larger. We could talk about uranium production or reprocessing or or several other questions related to energy, but I think the major topics are safety, waste, and proliferation. That's why I'm going to delve into those. Just before I start, to give you an idea on who is using nuclear energy today, of course, we have some major countries, which are the US, France, China, Russia, and still Japan to a certain degree. And there are a couple of other countries also having a certain amount of nuclear reactors online. But you clearly see that Africa, South America and Australia are nearly not using nuclear power. The whole of Asia has only very small amount of nuclear power in use. It's fundamentally Europe, the US, Russia, and China and Japan and a few countries. So we do have, start of this year, 443 nuclear power plants in operation with an installed capacity of 400 gigawatt. That's what nuclear is today. So we are talking about 33 countries that do use nuclear power today, of around 100 countries, 180 countries worldwide. And of these 33 countries, there are 23 countries with less than 10 nuclear power plants. So it's actually not that much. What is even more, 100 of these 440 nuclear power plants are already 40 years or older. So they are reaching their technical lifetime. Some countries are discussing about lifetime prolongations, but it's totally clear that the current nuclear fleet, which is on average older than 30 years, is nearing its end and will have to be replaced or will decrease and go out of operation in the next 10 or 20 years. There are a few power plants under construction, 52 nuclear power plants at the start of this year, mostly in China, some in India, in Korea, and in Russia. There are a few newcomer states with the United Arab Emirates, Bangladesh, Turkey, and Belarus. But it's not that much under construction to be able to keep up with the power plants that will have to go offline due to their age in the coming years and decades. The reactors that are today being built are still mostly and almost exclusively light water reactors of the generation 2 and 3, which are the reactors that are in operation today. There is talk about a so-called generation 4 and small modular reactors, but none of these reactors do exist today, and none of them are being built, or nearly none of them are being built today. It's basically still light water reactors of current generations. So just from these numbers, you will see that one important point in the discussion is lifetime prolongation for existing reactors, because without of that, it's clear that nuclear energy production will decline. But of course, prolongation of old reactors will increase the risk due to the typically to a safety standard of older reactors that is typically not comparable to the safety standards of reactors currently being built, newly built. And at the same time, new construction is not sufficient to keep the currently installed capacity constant. So what are the big points with respect to nuclear energy and the question on what could nuclear energy do and what are the risks? The one fundamental risk, of course, is the risk of safety. Where does it come from? Just shortly again, how does a nuclear reactor function? I mean, what you have is uranium fuel, usually uranium fuel, that is located in fuel elements in the reactor core. In this fuel, uranium is being split, and thereby heat is being produced. And then you have a rather conventional process like in other thermal power plants also. You have a cooling system that is transporting the heat produced here in the reactor core. In a first circle, you typically have a second circle in which another coolant is used that is producing steam from the heat being produced in the reactor core. And this steam is used to drive a turbine, which drives a generator, which produces electricity, which is sent to the grid. So far, so easy. Where do the problems come in? Well, first of all, nuclear had been deemed very attractive because it can achieve a very high power density, because the nuclear reaction compared to a chemical reaction gives you a factor of about 1 million more energy per reaction. So while in a chemical reaction you get electron volts of energy per reaction, you get mega electron volts or a million electron volts in a nuclear reaction. Thus you can produce a lot of energy in a very small volume, which is good from the point of view that you could get a lot of energy out of it, but which gives you a problem that you have to extract this heat without damaging your fuel, without destroying your reactor core. Then in typical light water reactors that we have today, you have long operation cycles, typically of a year, during which all the fuel that you need for this year is in the reactor core, and only after 1 year you get some fuel out of it and you put new fuel in there. And due to that, you have a high initial reactivity of the fuel. And during that year, you produce a lot of radioactivity in that reactor core. So the problems you have is controlling the reactivity of the reactor, that you do not produce too much energy, which is what happened basically in the Chernobyl nuclear accident, that your reactivity got out of control, and within fractions of a second, you produce so much energy that your reactor fundamentally exploded and it came to burning of the graphite moderator, and you extracted the high radioactive inventory from the core. And the third problem comes in due to the high radioactive inventory, which is the problem of decay heat, which means compared to other reactors, of course, you can shut down a nuclear reactor relatively easily. But even if you shut him down and it stops producing energy, it's still producing decay heat from the high radioactive inventory that's in the nuclear fuel. And a lot of heat is still being produced minutes, hours, days, weeks, and even years after you shut down your nuclear reactor. And you have to continuously cool the reactor. And if this does no longer work, then you're getting problem. We have seen that at the Fukushima event. Fukushima was flooded. The Fukushima side was flooded by a tsunami wave. The whole side was flooded with approximately 2 meters of water at the side level. So a lot of the facilities got destroyed, especially electricity for the coolant pumps that you need to cool your fuel have been destroyed. There was no electricity there to control the whole systems and to pump cooling water through the reactor core, which led to the effect that the fuel melted. Hydrogen was produced during that process. Hydrogen explosions took place that destroyed the reactors, and large amounts of reactivity got spread all over the place. So these are the fundamental risks with respect to reactor safety, that you have a high initial reactivity, high radioactive inventory, and you have a long time after shutdown of the reactor that you have to continuously cool the reactor to make sure that you're not getting into severe accidents. The consequences of severe accidents are shown here with a card showing the surrounding area of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And in red, you see the zones that are still confiscated or closed zones, or zones that are under permanently controlled due to the high amounts of radioactive material that have been thrown out of the power plant and that have been dispersed all over Europe, and that have contaminated these areas to a degree that you could no longer stay in these areas for longer times. The consequences of severe accidents of nuclear power plants could contaminate areas of several hundred square kilometers in large distances from the plants, and there are broad discussions about the follow-up costs for such accidents in Europe. And for example, an estimate of a technical support organization for the French nuclear authorities, the IRSN, calculated the follow-up costs for a big accident in Europe somewhere between 100 or 1,000 billion euros. So severe accidents are extremely expensive, and they have the potential to contaminate large areas of land so that they could no longer be used by humans for decades or centuries. For the currently existing reactor types, you have to clearly say that severe accidents cannot be completely excluded. We can increase safety systems, we can increase their technical functioning to reduce the probability of accidents, but we cannot physically exclude them. And the operational experience of the last decades shows us also that the number and severity of malfunction events is not significantly reduced. There are still events happening like Fukushima, like Chernobyl, but also a large amount of events in between these big accidents, showing that the system has difficulties. A nuclear power plant is a very complex system with a lot of safety systems that have to interact in the case of an accident. And we have examples of missed interactions between systems and of overlooked potentials for accidents. So we have to say that the risk is not fully eliminated even by majoring technologies. The second point that is very important is the problem of security. What do I mean by security? By security, I mean the topic of nuclear non-proliferation. Nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction, and I think I hope we agree that use of nuclear weapons will have to be avoided at any possible means. And the access to nuclear weapons today is mainly related to the question of whether a group of terrorists or a state or whoever wants to get a nuclear weapon gets access to nuclear weapons materials. The technology behind nuclear weapons is rather well known, I would say, and is not that big a technological hurdle, but the access to nuclear weapons related materials is really of major importance. And the essential materials you need for a nuclear weapon are either plutonium, which you could get by reprocessing spent fuel from nuclear reactors, or it's highly enriched uranium, which you get by enriching uranium, a technology that you also need for the civilian nuclear energy production. There are other materials, but I don't want to go into them. And so we have a lot of dependencies between the civil and the military regime today, which is called the dual use potential of nuclear energies. And we have to strongly control those and focus on those also to make sure that civilian materials and civilian technology is not used for the production of nuclear weapons. Just to make you clear how much, what are we talking about? I mean, this photo shows the nuclear part of the Trinity nuclear weapon test device, which was the first nuclear device that ever exploded on the Earth. And in here is the nuclear material needed for the Trinity nuclear device. So this is a ball showing the actual size of the nuclear core of a nuclear weapon. You see it's not much. It's around 5 to 10 kilograms of nuclear material that you need for one nuclear explosive device. And here I show you just a list of fissile material stocks at the end of 2019. Parts of it are military stockpiles, especially the highly enriched uranium and the military plutonium, but we do also have large amounts of civilian plutonium stockpiles, plutonium that has been separated in the process of reprocessing, but which has no actual use today and is thus being stored in the different states, especially the United Kingdom and France. The United Kingdom today has around 120 tons of separated plutonium being stored and don't know what to do with it. And again, 5 to 10 kilograms are enough to construct a nuclear bomb. So Mohammed El-Baradei, former IAEA Director General, said that some estimates indicate that 40 countries or more now have the know-how to produce nuclear weapons. We are relying primarily on the continued good intentions of these countries, which could be subject to rapid change. The information and expertise on how to produce nuclear weapons has become more accessible. This places extra emphasis on the importance of controlling access to nuclear weapon usable material. And under the current regime, with which he means the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, there is nothing illicit for a non-nuclear state to conduct uranium enrichment activities or even to possess military-grade nuclear material. And this shows that there is a strong connection between civil use of nuclear energy and the potential of countries or even sub-state groups to gain access to nuclear weapons. The third big point, of course, is waste. Just to make clear what's the point about the waste problem, I wanted to show these graphs showing you the degree of radioactivity in certain different sorts of materials. And we start around here. That's even in food, you can find natural radioactivity, but to a very low degree. Compared to that, already the uranium ore, that is the material that goes into the reactor, is 3 orders of magnitude or a factor of 1,000 and more higher than food. But of course, then during the use in the nuclear power plants, a lot of radioactivity is produced in the uranium being introduced in the nuclear reactor in the form of fission products and other materials. And so if you're looking at the end product of the nuclear chain, we have irradiated fuel elements, or we have the material coming out of reprocessing of such fuel elements. And this is up here on that screen. So you're about a factor of 10 to the power of 9 higher than the uranium ore, or even a factor 1,000 again higher than what you have in food. So you have an extremely high amount of radioactivity concentrated in the spent nuclear fuel. And of course, the waste problem relates to the question of how do we deal with these wastes stemming from nuclear energy? What are we going to do with it? The current way to deal with it, or the plans to deal with it, are that we are going to dispose it in final geologic disposals. The idea is that we bring it deep under earth, which will not be an easy endeavor. We will have to find a place where we can show that we believe it's safe for approximately 1 million years. That's the time scale that at least in Germany, we say these high-level radioactive wastes are so dangerous that we have to exclude them from the biosphere. This will be difficult technical endeavor, and especially I'm not going into the alternatives here for timely reason, but especially we have to clearly say worldwide, there is still no geological repository for commercial spent fuel in operation. So while we have 33 countries using nuclear energy today, with large amounts of highly radioactive waste being amassed worldwide, we still have no commercial geologic repository available worldwide. Just shortly before I end, I think, of course, you also have to talk about costs. I'm not going into detail into this, but just to give you the examples of what happened in the Western countries during the last decades. All projects that have been, all new nuclear power plants that have been built in Western countries during the last decades are listed on these 2 slides. This is Olkiluoto in Finland, it's Flamanville in France, it's Hinkley Point in the UK. For all of those, the initial cost estimates were like 2.5 billions or 3 billions or 4 billions. The actual costs today are still not clear, but we are more talking about 10 or 12, or for Hinkley Point, about 20 billions for 2 plants. So costs have increased extremely over the last years. Besides the European plants, we also had 4 plants that were started to being built in the US after long discussions in the 2000s about a renaissance of nuclear energy in the US. 2 plants at the summer plant have been started to construct around 2012. In 2017, actually, the projects have been abandoned after the cost estimates have been driven to 25 billion plus, and a few billions of US dollar had already been spent. This is the side when the plant had been abandoned. You see that a lot of money had been spent, but then being abandoned. And another project at Vogtel is still being built. There you see the same picture. Cost estimates have increased considerably, at least a factor of 2. Construction is delayed, and whether this plant will actually be finalized, yeah, we will have to see. Compared to this, it's important to remember that 10 or 20 years ago, when the discussions about the renaissance of nuclear energy started, of course, the economic numbers for renewables were different. And I mean, solar was still extremely expensive. In 2009, solar was still up here. Even wind was not really cheap. It was still up here, and other technologies were comparable or cheaper. But if you're looking at the development during only the last 10 years, you see that prices for solar have dropped 90%, prices for wind have gone down 70%, and compared to that, prices for nuclear have not come down, but have even increased by 26%. So nuclear is not cost effective, it's not cheap, and it takes a very long time to be built. And so therefore, it's also very difficult to see nuclear as any help in the discussion about climate change. Thanks. That's what I wanted to talk about.
Thank you, Christoph. It's shocking to learn about the follow-up cost of nuclear accident and the impact that remain in the long term. Thank you for sharing your expert overview of nuclear power energy complexity, especially the problem of reactor safety and security. I will come back again to you. While I will pass the floor to Mrs. Patricia Lorenz from Friends of the Earth Europe. She has started to work with Austrian environmental organization Global 2000. She focused on the nuclear power plants surrounding Austria. In 2000, she started the Bullish Euratom campaign with the Friends of the Earth Brussels. Patricia has gained expertise on many nuclear issues like nuclear safety, nuclear liability, and she has participated in numerous ESPO processes, environmental impact assessment in transboundary context. The floor is yours, Patricia.
Yeah, hello. So first I try to share the screen. Is it working? It seems to me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so good morning. Yeah, as you said, I work now for Friends of the Earth Europe. And I say this because I'm mostly doing lobbying, and we follow the discussion and try to influence it. And so I think I can start to a certain extent where Christoph, this is really very interesting and concise presentation, stopped. I somehow prepared this also under the impression, of course, on the ongoing discussion, which is this kind of, there's something new and nuclear is back. In my age group, we heard this already at least 2 times. So, but factually, as we saw already, not much is really changing. Actually, the downward development of nuclear is continuing on many levels. And I say this now, although I spoiler everything, it's, what I find amazing is that nuclear industry and of course those member states that we see which are now pushing this discussion heavily, they pretend as if it will be a kind of yes or no discussion. Yeah, as if I would offer you something, yeah, just take it. I mean, there's a nuclear power plant and we build it. They even call it a kind of plug-in, yeah, these new so-called new SMRs. But this, of course, is simply not the case. So I say this already in the beginning, that I think it's not a discussion. And because when we also take this 10-year window of opportunity to severely reduce the CO2 emissions to make a difference at all, when you think that if we would start, any country would start, even those who already have nuclear infrastructure, so to speak, the construction of a nuclear power plant, now it would take them about 20 years. This is not only what we observe and can show with data, but it's also what, for example, the Czech nuclear regulator told them. Perhaps you have time to look into the preparation of the current nuclear projects. So 20 years, if at all, as we saw from Christoph's presentations, nuclear power plant projects, even in the US, which of course is a, so to speak, nuclear superpower, they also tend to collapse. So, and I think this is, for me, this is among the key points in this discussion that we also have to point out. It's not saying yes or no, and the environmentalists are nasty and don't want it. It's besides all those problems already seen in the presentation, it's also that industry simply does not deliver. And so this is the present situation. I was asked to talk about past and present, but we are in the present. So I will quickly look into, yeah, so I started actually, so nothing really changed. So there is this trend, as we see, there is less and less of course installed capacity. I will show later. And I already mentioned Renaissance, the first one that we saw that was announced around the year 2000, mainly in Europe. There they said, yeah, we need the so-called economies of scale. And if we have more megawatt per reactor, obviously the costs go down. So the EPR, the European Pressurized Reactor, a French-German project was launched, and construction started. Not a single one is operating yet. Only one in China, where there seem to be severe problems with the fuel. But of course, it's hard to get real information from China. But otherwise, Olkiluoto and Flamanville, as the EPRs that started construction around 2003 or 2005, are not yet operating. Also, what's also always been around ever since is the waste solution is somehow around the corner, but nothing is really moving. We also produced a paper on the situation, and we looked into it, and I found it really surprising that more and more also problems with materials are coming up, and the corrosion issue, for example, for the containers that are actually needed to put the highly radioactive fuel inside seem to be rather increasing the more research is done into it. And also the solution expected to be delivered in Sweden, the famous copper canisters, which were seen as a solution, which could also be used irrespectively of the geological surroundings, is not being confirmed. There seems to be also corrosion issues. And the only thing that is new, I think, is this growing dependence on public financing. They are extremely expensive, as Christoph showed, and I will also show again. But now, when you look at how this Hinkley Point 20 billion price tag is financed, it's amazing loans by the state. They have guarantees for 35 years, a guaranteed price for which the state will buy it and then put this on the market. And the same we are seeing now with the Dukovany 5 reactor in the Czech Republic, where the state has been always increasing the loan they offer for building the reactor, and now they reached 100%. So the same also I understand is for those 6 reactors now. French President Macron is announcing they will most likely also finance it if it ever moves ahead. But they said they don't see any other way. Those reactors they're discussing in France won't be ready for 2038, even in their own planning. So this, I think, is really important to keep in mind, that industry actually cannot deliver this. Yeah, and so now from these big EPRs with 1,600 or 700 megawatt, industry is now back to the slogan of the SMRs, the small modular reactors, which is under 300 megawatt, where they of course back to the problem they had before, that of course you still have fixed costs which are very high, but less obviously output. And what I also would like to say, this plug and play concept, as they seriously call it, I think they cannot pretend that they would have less licensing and other issues, earthquake issues on these sites than you have for larger reactors. They also have to be safe. I also add a little bit to looking into the past. I hope this is visible. For me, it's not so good. But here you see from when are the reactors. So you see these in the 70s and 80s. The now existing fleet was installed. These were times, of course, of non-liberalized energy markets, where any costs simply were put on the customer. This is not possible anymore. And from 1986 to Nobel, basically reactors were not ordered anymore. And there you see, of course, the result of the newly connected reactors. Here is the same, more or less the same picture. The age of the reactors is now more than 30. Some already are even 50 years old. For example, Betznau in Switzerland. And I also like this one. I hope it's visible. We had this made for a conference 2 years ago. You see all here, you see the forecasts made, for example, by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a UN agency, and pretending to be a kind of nuclear watchdog, but of course, actually, they are more a kind of propaganda institution. So here you see over the past decades, the forecast they made, and this down here is how it really ended. And I think we are again in the same phase where institutions are claiming that the big development is coming, but actually it won't take place. And I think one of the reasons is, of course, those amazing costs, the difficulty in licensing, but also that industry is losing, of course, its capacities of constructing those plants, because there is no market and there is less and less companies doing it. And even you already mentioned now ongoing construction, for example, of this European pressurized reactor in Flamanville. There are severe technical problems, even with the reactor lid. You have falsifications, you have steel problems. And I think all this, of course, is increasing simply because they have less and less to build. Here I also have the ongoing projects in Europe, which is very little. And I would like to point out one, because we work on it a lot, is those 2 units in Slovakia, in Mochovce 3 and 4, which is a typical project, an old one where they're trying to finish an old reactor. There are enormous technical problems, which you could say only has to do, of course, with the situation in Slovakia. But I think what is now becoming clear and clear, that the whole regulator regime, the safety system, where also now in this discussion concerning climate, the countries like to pretend that there would be EU safety standards, which are the highest in the world, as they say, and they're being kept. And there's the international ones represented by the IAEA, and therefore everything is safe. And under international regulation, it's really very important to understand that this actually does not exist. This is a kind of voluntary exercises. For example, countries like Slovakia undertake when they have a so-called mission to check on the progress in their plant. I mean, they still do as they believe, and the national regulator is still extremely powerful, and they can hardly be forced by anyone to do something they don't want to. So it's still national standards in the end. And I think we see this very well with Mochovce. I already mentioned Flamanville 3. Construction started 2007. It should already be operating, but it's not. Same type of EPR is in Olkiluoto. So these were the so-called flagship reactors from the Renaissance around 2000. Hinkley Point C was already mentioned. This is guaranteed price for 35 years. And then is the other way, the Russian reactor projects. We have 2 units being more or less perhaps built in Hungary, which is Paksh 5 and 6 on already existing site, which is a very difficult project also because it's came with a Russian loan, so it's very unclear what's really happening, and they seem to be slightly cheaper. And this is the Rosatom, where it come, as I said, for €5,000, and there is a project planned in the Czech Republic for Dukovany. There is some tender might be coming up, but here is the geopolitical problem is that the Chinese offers will be, so the Chinese will not be allowed to join the tender and to build a Chinese reactor in the Czech Republic. And somehow there is a political understanding it shouldn't be a Russian reactor either. Besides the fact that many people still doubt that this will be kept, is also any company, but Rosatom, really able to offer reactors, because as we see, the EPR is in severe problems. Yeah, and just quickly, I think I also have to end soon. There is, of course, new hazards. We also have climate change, also, of course, has impacts on nuclear power plants. I only go quickly, we can talk perhaps later about it. It's, of course, there is less and less water in the rivers, and they are needed for cooling. During the heat waves in Europe, reactors really had to be turned off. And here I would also quickly look at why is this big noise about nuclear right now. I think it's mostly about achieving lifetime extensions. I think they want to get money, even more money for research, weaken the regulation. I think is also, and already mentioned, is of course these enormous risks for society is a complete waste of money, because renewables are much cheaper, much more reliable, and much faster to deploy than nuclear. And I think now the time is, we have less and less time, we would lose opportunity. The risks of severe accidents is obvious, it cannot be excluded for any plant. And the risk is increasing because the plants are getting older, and the accumulation of the unsolved radioactive waste is been mentioned, and no country is really getting closer. And now, as the last thing I would like to say, what we mostly work on is now the so-called EU taxonomy. Taxonomy is so simply listing technologies which should receive preferential financing, to put this generally. Nuclear was excluded based on scientific study called the Technical Expert Group. But now, after severe lobbying, which is now reaching unbelievable levels, it should enter the taxonomy, nuclear energy. And you wonder, how can this be? How do they argue? And we also analyzed the Joint Research Center's report. So mainly they say new reactors are safe because they will fulfill all the regulations. I just would like to remind everyone that, of course, Fukushima also fulfilled all the regulations valid then, but it couldn't prevent extreme accident from happening. And on waste, the Joint Research Center said, yeah, the things are on track, preparations are happening, and these final repositories, when they will be licensed, they will fulfill all the regulations. Therefore, there is no waste problem, and everything is safe, so we can use nuclear also in the taxonomy to combat climate change. Yeah, I think this is it for now, and perhaps you have questions.
Thank you, Patricia. It's surprising to see how the European member states jointly share common solid political standpoints in many issues and common climate targets, but when it comes to nuclear energy, they are divided. I guess from the CSO side, we have to be even more demanding for a joint position in this issue. Thank you, and I will come back to you later on. Now I will pass the floor to Petros. Petros has finished his master's studies in nuclear engineering in 2015 and has co-chaired the European Nuclear Society's Young Generation Network from 2017 till 2021. The floor is yours, Petro.
Thank you very much. Just a second, I need to prepare. We are back now in full office. It's been a while for virtual presentations. Okay, just No, sorry, just I want to split screen so that you can see me. Perfect. So, all right. Good morning, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Petros. I'm concluding my PhD these days. Just submitted my thesis beginning of the week.
Sorry, your screen is not shared. We are seeing still the presentation of Patrizia.
Better now?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. So just submitted my thesis on Monday and tried to recover from the stress loads. So I would like to show you a bit what we are doing. So from the European Nuclear Society point of view, from the young generation. I'm the past chair since half a year now. I'm reaching the age limits next year, I think. So I'm basically a retiree, and it feels great to be back and to get a bit on stage. So, come on. Yes. Who we are. So in the 90s, our industry faced the troubles that were mentioned before, that we had a very aging expert group. So like our fleet, also our workers were aging, and we had a very high average age of professionals. And the new guys that entered, and so men and women experts that were in the 20s, 30s, they are facing troubles that the old generation could not address. For example, like if you talk about maternity leave, or if you talk about career development, and all the upper management is about, let's say 50 to 60 years old. I'm not really sure if they can really feel you. So we decided to form the young generation. So the young generation is a volunteers network of nuclear experts and the students who have not surpassed the age limit of, I think it's about 35. So we are part of our mother society, the European Nuclear Society, the biggest nuclear society in Europe. And we have about 23 member states right now, and including the Women in Nuclear, the World Nuclear Association, the IAEA, and the World Association for Nuclear Operators. And so far, according to my knowledge as an engineer and talking with all the other friends in engineering, we have never seen such a similar platform of youngsters on a technical base from a job professional point of view background. So originally designed to help knowledge transfer from, as mentioned before, the elderly to the younger, to keep it on site. Also for giving access to networking, as the industry in certain countries like my country in Switzerland is rather small, and the possibilities can be limited to let's say only operation or only waste depository research. And if I would be more interested in fuel development or reactor developments, I would have more chances abroad. So we have our own, I have here in the center, forum, biannual forums every 2 years. The last one was this year in Tarragona, where 200 to 400 youngsters come together and exchange their experience, their knowledge, and their research. And we have a lead role in the Nuclear for Climate campaign that we formed. I will talk about it in a second. So, electricity production worldwide. I updated the slides yesterday. My last slides, the presentation I gave on this subject was from 2017, sorry. So I had the numbers from 2018. And what was frustrating to see is that from 2014 to 2018, so the numbers are from the International Energy Agency, the World Energy Outlook 2019. Why 2019? Because 2020, 2021 with COVID's crisis is not really representative. So we'll have to wait for next year for the more representative figures. We have a good 65% share of fossil fuels in the electricity generation, which is even bigger because luckily oil is not being burned and wasted for electricity, but it's of course a very big deal in the transportation and heating. So if we look into heating, this share gets actually even bigger. So we're talking about 81%. And we have here split the others, so the green sources, basically the low carbon sources, which are 10% nuclear, 15% hydro, and the combined 10% of wind, solar, bioenergy, and geothermal. What was updated from 2014 is in the total cake of the low carbon, we increased worldwide our share from 32 to 35%. If we continue with these rates, we will decarbonize the electricity production by 2100 earliest in optimistic case. So talking only about electricity, we have not tackled yet the additional transportation and heating problem. So the only thing that grew, actually, that this is also true, that was said before by my previous speakers, was the renewable share increased. The hydro stayed the same, and the nuclear more or less stayed the same, plus minus 1%. So we saw that in the last 4 years, by only pushing renewables, we are not advancing in a too fast way. This is where we came in, because we youngsters believe that we should provide. We thank the previous generation for providing us the wealth and situation that we achieved today, that we were able to grow up in a rather, let's say, safe environment where luckily in most of Europe, not everywhere yet, but we hope for the best for all of the world, we didn't suffer from any bigger crisis, and we were able to, like me, educate ourselves in different fields, what we chose and wanted to. But now it's our task to take over and to shape the future even better for the generation to come, so they can have the same possibilities as we had. And this is where the Nuclear for Climate petition came in. We started this in 2011 and continued from there on. So the COP21 in Paris was our founding time. And we've participated in various climate change conferences and other panels where we try to give a scientific and technology neutral approach to what we are doing and what we believe with our expert knowledge to do. So reminding again that this is all our spare time, we're volunteers, and we don't have anyone paying us for doing this. Even right now, this is my basically work time that I have to compensate later. So motivation of the Paris Agreement, we want to decarbonize. So we have on the left-hand side, the big emitters, coal, gas, and I think oil was dropped for, because the electricity doesn't contribute that much. And we have on the right-hand side our low carbon sources, which all have their strengths, benefits, and also disadvantages and weaknesses. And the IPCC identified 3 types of the International Panel for Climate Change, identified 3 types of carbon-free or low carbon actually electricity sources, which is the classic renewables, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, nuclear, and they even contemplate the carbon capture and storage solution, which up to date has not really achieved industrial scale, but we see what research will give us. So the IAEA forecasted that we will need, from today's perspective, if we look into nuclear, since this is my expert area, we will have to double the worldwide if we want to achieve the 2-degree or even the beyond 2-degree scenario. So our current 451 1-gigawatt reactors would need to become around 900 to 1,000. Not taking into account, as also mentioned before, the aging fleet that needs to be replaced. So we're talking of a very big scale of nuclear capacity that we need to enable. Challenges we're facing in decarbonizing, we have here, I took from Eurostat the statistics of the consumer, not the market spot price, the consumer price paid by every single habitant. And what we can see here is basically that Denmark and Germany, that did a lot of investments in the sole renewable field, also share the highest consumer prices in electricity. And that is fair enough. I mean, we have to develop into a green future, and we have to pay the price that the product actually has, which means that transportation has to become more expensive as it is too cheap today. We have to pay for the gray costs that we don't take into account nowadays. But if we look into this little app called Electricity Map, so from an electricity production point of view, it didn't particularly pay off. This is for Germany, especially speaking, because the Germans replaced one low carbon energy source with another low carbon energy source. And if at the same time, the German government 10 years ago would have decided we phase out coal and keep our youngest, most modern reactors and the safest reactors worldwide, according to stress tests online, Germany would be in a much better carbon emitting point of view from the electricity standpoint of view. So Norway, Sweden, and France have the greenest and the cleanest electricity production, followed by us in Switzerland. And what we have in common, except for Norway that has 100% hydro, is that Sweden has a nuclear hydro mix, France has a nuclear hydro mix, and Switzerland has a nuclear hydro mix. So mostly. So if we replace our low carbon again with low carbon, we will not get any further. What we have to replace is, like in Poland, we have to replace fossils with low carbon, being it wind, solar, hydro where possible and feasible, and nuclear. The challenges we face as youngsters is, of course, communication. This is attributed to our ancestors. It was mentioned before, the nuclear weapons program. Obviously, the Americans, when they developed nuclear weapons, they spread the fear of radiation and they feeded it because they wanted to be a superpower worldwide. And this fear of radiation now basically bites us back, as we say in German, that the snail bites its own tail. And we have to do a lot of communication and educating people on what radiation really is and what is harmful. So I took here an example from the What If book, where people ask different questions. And there was a scientist who actually took the time to go through various questions, and he published a very funny book. So what if I took a swim in a spent nuclear fuel pool? And the answer is the first 4 meters, there's basically no real harm to be expected from the pure radiation. I'm not talking about contaminants like particles that could emit. We're talking about the radiation that comes from the fuel. Obviously, you wouldn't do it because if a piece breaks off and it starts swimming, you could get harmed by this piece that is radiating. But the radiation that's coming from the spent fuel pool at the bottom and the 8 meters of water, the 4 meters above are basically already enough to be safe. And then within the 4 meters, you would get the fatal doses. And what we are having also troubles in this communication is obviously to convince people that that we're a viable source. One of the points was also mentioned before, our strength, and then the challenge for engineers to deal with it is our immense fuel energy density. I took this rights comic from XKCD, a scientific comic. So uranium, and I'm not even talking about other isotopes like thorium, have an immense energy density, which means that on a very small scale, so the landscape, the resource center, the mines, everything has a very small footprint area-wise, resource-wise, compared to the amount of energy that I can release. The Polish started very funny, so I was asked to give some examples of the youngsters, what are we doing? They started to make a small booklet, which they distribute in Warsaw. They have a scientific picnic every year, at least until 2 years ago. I hope they will continue next year again. And they managed to get a small booklets about 100 riddles about nuclear energy. So it's technical difficulties explained on a very simple matter for normal people to understand, since our technology, as it was also mentioned before, is very complex, and it can be quite immense, the information quantity that one receives on nuclear power. So this year we started our sub-campaign of the Nuclear for Climate, which is called Net Zero Needs Nuclear, for the COP26. So we have youngsters mainly, yeah, that was not supposed to happen. Mainly British ones, since it's in Glasgow and travel restrictions are still difficult. That will go and have a stand on the climate change conference. And that's why I'm here as a retiree and not the current chair, because they're very busy in preparing everything, as they want to inform people and also transfer knowledge on why we need also nuclear in the whole energy mix. That's all. I kept it short. I hope I'm within time limits, more or less. So thanks for your attention, and I'm ready for the questions that you have.
Thank you, Petros, for sharing the viewpoint of the European Nuclear Society of Young Generation Network and introducing your work on nuclear energy on an international level. It's very important to have diverse thoughts on the debate of nuclear energy, and thank you also for highlighting the challenge of communication. This is what currently YE, in cooperation with Heinrich-Böll Foundation European Union, is trying to target, to equip young people with proper information and knowledge to understand and tackle nuclear energy issues. Following the discussion, while we have been collecting the registration for the workshop, we have received different questions addressed to our speakers, to Christopher, to Patricia, and Petros. touching upon different relevant nuclear energy issues, also related to young people. I want to invite the participants and that are attending the workshop. If you have any question, please raise your hands or write your question on the chat. So I'm starting with the first question, which is, can nuclear energy power future generations safely and sustainably? And I would like to have your opinion one by one. Firstly, Christoph.
Well, as I've tried to point out in my talk, I think Germany has decided to phase out nuclear power after decades of intense public discussions. And the fundamental reasons why we've taken this decision is that nuclear power brings specific risks of severe accidents, risks of nuclear proliferation, and risks related to the nuclear waste problem, as I've shown in my presentation. And as I see that we do have alternative solutions to the problem of climate change by introducing renewable energies, solar, wind, and other technologies, I do not see that we need nuclear power to tackle climate change. And I'm convinced that the risks of current nuclear power override the use that we have from it, apart from clearly, as Patricia has also shown, the problem that the timescale is completely different. I mean, we will take 15 to 20 years, the least, to plan and build new nuclear power plants. And most of the countries worldwide want to be CO2 free by 2050. So there's simply not enough time to engage in nuclear to any relevant degree.
Thank you, Christoph. Patricia?
Yeah, really hard to answer, not to repeat everything we said already. I think what would be interesting, of course, is to hear from the other side why things should change now. I mean, also the mysterious new reactors, basically there is nothing much new. The problems stay the same. Also, the old slogan that was used after Chernobyl, it's the Russian technology's fault, or safety standards are not good enough, and so on. All this was proven wrong with Fukushima. As we know, it's a high-tech country, Japan, it was a different type of reactor. So I think we would have to focus also to speak on the other side, where they see the sudden difference. The costs are enormous, so it's really not an answer at all. Also to report back, for example, from Austria, which is a non-nuclear country, we now also have to speed up, of course, decarbonization. And for electricity, the government now put out a plan by which by 2030, all electricity will be covered by decarbonization, meaning hydro and renewable electricity, at least balance-wise produced in Austria by 2030. So, of course, Austria has a different position. This is high, of course, share of hydro power, and we are aware that this is not possible for every country, but the time schedule is much tighter than any nuclear power plant will be finished. So it would be interesting to hear how the young nuclear fans imagine what should change now out of a sudden. I think this is where we should start discussing, because from our point, technology didn't change, circumstances are only getting worse for nuclear, as we, I think, pointed out.
Thank you, Patricia and Petros. Do you have an answer?
Well, I think we won't have too much of a choice, because we need, if we take nuclear out of the equation, we're going to be left with other problems that we have to face in designing the grid and everything around it. The less base load energy, so basically energy that's available 24/7. And here in Switzerland now we are facing these troubles that we're getting warned that this winter we might get cut down from electricity already next winter, so this winter to come, because electricity is not available the whole time. So the less base load we have, the higher the instability in the grid gets, the more capacities we need to build in batteries. So if you take nuclear out, And hydro being the last one remaining, which not everyone has access to and the possibility to build, it's going to be incredibly difficult to reshape the whole grid and everything that comes around it. So we're going to face a whole new troubles. Regarding the question of what has changed, is nothing has changed. This is true. I mean, the generations available that we have, the generation 3 reactors that were mentioned, are light water reactors, and this is the technology we have today and that we have to build because time is pressing. The Gen 4 types, the research is going forward, and we have first prototypes running, one in Russia, one in the US, which show very, very positive signs. But we cannot rely on, yeah, maybe in 10 years we will have a generation 4 reactor ready. We do this in parallel, like with the ITER, the fusion project. But what we would need to build now is very fast generation 3 reactors. And France in the 70s has proven that if you really upscale and mean it, they built 58 reactors within 20 years. So 58 gigawatt added within a small time scale of 20 years. And this is where we need to get back. We need to industrialize Europe again. We need to stop our deindustrialization. We need to start getting production back, and we need to gain experience again in building big projects.
Thank you for, Patrizia, do you have something to add, or Christoph?
Well, sure. I mean, we don't have time to re-industrialize, as you call it. I mean, we are industrialized. We have technologies. We have wind. We have solar. We are industrializing now in storage capacities. We are industrializing in intelligent grids. We are industrializing in adjusting demand side and production side. And especially what we don't need are baseload technologies. I mean, the future is that we will have, even if your plans of using nuclear as sort of a backup or whatsoever, nuclear will have a share of the best 10, 20, 30%. I mean, that means you're facing a system with 60 or 70% flexible technologies like solar and wind. In any case, you will need the grids, you will need storage capacity. Nuclear will by no means change this. And then you get nuclear as a inflexible baseload technology into that system. So how will they engage? What will nuclear do? Do you plan to have nuclear power plants, EPR reactors, that will be there as backup electricity production technologies in cases where you have less photovoltaics and wind in the system? Then you will end up with a nuclear power plant being used 10 or 20% of the time of a year, each year, which will mean that you will produce only that you will have a production capacity of 10% and not of 85 or 90%, which is what current estimates of electricity prices of a nuclear reactor are based on. I mean, if you're producing only 10% of this energy in the reactor, even the price will even furthermore increase. So I don't see the use of nuclear in an electricity system that is flexible and that is driven by renewables and by demand side. Yeah, and I don't see that we have the time to bring an industry back to fulfill what they promise. I mean, you had a chance in the 2000s when we were talking about a renaissance of nuclear, and when big plans were made of building lots of new nuclear power plants, and it did not happen. So why do we believe that it would happen now? I mean, I just don't see it.
Thank you, Christoph. It's obvious that the debate on nuclear energy is very diverse. The second question, and I will need an answer within 1 minute if it's possible. What's the role of young people in tackling nuclear energy issues, and what's your suggestion to them? How could they advance their involvement in the political discussion?
I see a couple of roles. I mean, first of all, of course, we see that a new generation is coming in. And so the most important role is for them to understand the issue. I mean, we had discussions taking on for decades in Germany. After we have decided on the issue in Germany, of course, these discussions got less. So there are new people coming in. that don't remember what we have discussed in Germany or worldwide during all these decades. And you need to know the issue. You need to understand what the actual chances are that nuclear might offer, but also what the actual risks are that nuclear might offer. And you need to understand the full picture to make a fact-based decision on the issue. So you have to engage in the topic and understand what's out there. That's one of the big important points. And then, of course, we still have a legacy to deal with. I mean, we have large amounts of spent nuclear fuel and of other highly radioactive wastes worldwide, and we will have to take care of those. We still have operating nuclear power plants, and we have to ensure their safety for the rest of their lifetime. So there are still issues that we have to deal with.
Thank you, Christoph. Patricia?
Yeah, it's hard to add anything. I think it's what you're doing is the way I think many young people, including my own at home, they think nuclear is over anyway. Things like this cannot happen anymore. So it's really important to tell them that accidents simply happen as long as there are nuclear power plants. I mean, you can't exclude it. This is a mathematical fact, which also has to be understood. And at the same time, the waste situation is, I have to say, I feel this personally strongly, because when we said 30 years ago, there is no solution. Yeah, it was 30 years ago, but when you really look at it, there was no progress made, which I really find scary, I have to say. Only the piles are growing bigger. And I think this is not so clear to many people. That also, as we see here, industry is trying to come back. And I think they understand when they really look at it. Of course, they cannot double the capacities they have now. They cannot even replace what has to be taken off the grid. Because it's, I don't know how they imagine this reindustrialization. We know that the whole industry's capacity to, for example, the reactor pressure vessel to build seems to be not more, they are not able to produce more than one worldwide, if at all. And as I said earlier, there seems to be severe technological failures around when they try to construct, as we see for decades now, those generation 3 reactors. So I think this has to be understood, that, as I said earlier, what has to be understood, it's not a decision yes or no. It just seems not to be possible. That they deliver more than looking after those plants that are now to be phased out. And there's enormous decommissioning problems coming up. And the final repository research is stuck in basically most places. So it's mostly about understanding that this is not a no or yes decision, because nuclear is just not able to deliver.
Thanks, Petros.
So very shortly, I agree with Dr. Christoph Pistner that we need to engage the youth, the young people. They demand, and it's their right to demand, and it's also their. In German we have this term which I don't know in English. It's called the Narrenfreiheit. So basically that they can demand things not knowing if they can happen or not. The most important thing is that they have to get all the facts together, and what we, as I tried to explain before, what we just fear is that a lot of people make decisions based on very emotional decisions and less on fact-based decisions. So if people get their facts together and they make themselves an opinion, then I think this is the best way that this can go forward. So we need to supply them with all the data they need, so that they can propose solutions that are not just what they want, but also what could be done.
Well, in this case, I'm sorry, but then I have to bring up one point, but I mean, it's so obvious. Sorry. If you want to talk fact-based, please stop showing funny graphs about swimming pools with spent fuel in there and questioning on whether someone is going to swim in there. I mean, that's not what we are talking about. No one is going to swim in a spent fuel pool. What we are talking about is a Fukushima-like situation in which a large earthquake has damaged a facility, in which a large hydrogen explosion destroyed a facility where you had several days in which you did not know the situation of spent fuel pools. You did not know whether there was still water in there. And I mean, large communities, even the US NRC calculated that if there's no longer water in that swimming pool, then the spent fuel will catch fire and it will release extremely large amounts of cesium up to the situation in which Tokyo would have to be evacuated. So please, if you want to talk about facts, don't show funny pictures about swimming pools.
Thank you for your answer. I guess that what we have received from the panel, like the outcomes of the panel of discussion, we will use the outcomes for the second workshop that we will organize in frame of this project, and we will expand the debate over the topics that we covered during this panel of discussion. We have also a question from Claire. If one of you, Claire, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly to one of the speakers, or? Okay, so I'm reading.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, thanks. Maybe for Petros, and if anybody else wants to address it, of course, that would be great as well. So I'm just wondering, you know, as climate-induced drought, climate crisis-induced drought is putting a lot of pressure on our water supplies, how is the massive need for water in energy, nuclear energy, compatible with combating the climate crisis? And of course, it will obviously need a diversion of water resources as well to the plants to make sure that they're cooled. So with the pressure we're facing with water and the biodiversity of our rivers, how is this compatible with our need to combat the climate crisis?
Well, I was just replying in the text, but now I can do it in person. So most of our sites are, even nowadays, already built on in coastal lines. So most of the nuclear reactors worldwide are seawater cooled. So it's only the inner ones in the continents that use river water for cooling. And this certainly has to be taken into account. So that in the selection process of the site, one has to make a forecast on what the shape will look like in the next 50 to 100 years, depending on the lifetime of the reactor. So there are, of course, places where today you would not build anymore a nuclear site, and knowing what will happen to this site. But there are others that at the same time emerge. So I mean, we see that the seawater solution is probably the best one, since it's more stable. So as long as we have enough of a height difference to the coastline to be safe from the sea level rise and from waves or tsunamis. And for the ones that have river cooled, like my country, for example, we have only river cooled units. It's taken into account in the whole safety analysis that we're doing, so that if the water level decreases, we had this 2 years ago. The water was not too low, but the water was too hot, and they had to decrease power up to the point where there's a shutdown margin, even where they have to shut down to keep the reactor safe. So this is all being taken into account while selecting and analyzing during operation.
Thank you, Petros, Christopher, and Patricia. I will invite the participants. If you have any further question, you can send it to my email, and I can share it with the speakers. Thank you for sharing your opinions with us. It's very important for us as young people and young climate activists to be exposed with the right and science-based information on nuclear energy in order to have and create a strong standpoint on nuclear energy within the European youth climate movement. We really appreciate your participation in the panel of discussion, and thank you for spending your Friday morning with us. Christoph, Patricia, and Petros.
Big pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks for the invitation.